Former Prime Minister Tony Abbott is on the advisory board of Advance Australia, the Conservative lobby group supporting the campaign against the Voice to Parliament. I spoke to him earlier. Tony Abbott, welcome to 7:30.
Thanks, Sarah.
You wrote last year, done badly, recognition would entrench race-based separatism. What evidence do you have for that?
Well, I'm a supporter of recognition, but this isn't recognition. This is about power. And my problem with the Voice, as it currently stands and as it will be put to the people, is that, first of all, it entrenches race in our Constitution.
Race, which is already in our Constitution.
Second, it reinforces the separatism, which I think is at the heart of Indigenous disadvantage. And third, it gums up our system of government even more.
Now, I just want to stay with the idea of separatism, because you've often joined the idea of gumming up in government. But on separatism, how can an advisory body like The Voice, which has no power itself to create legislation, raise that apartheid-style separatism that you're describing there?
Well, Sarah, this isn't just any old advisory body. It will be a body sanctified in the Constitution, with a constitutionally guaranteed right to make representations on anything effectively to everyone. And if the government or the agency to which the representations are made does not respond effectively, it could all quite easily end up in the High Court. And this is why, in perhaps an unguarded moment, Prime Minister Albanese said that it would be a very brave government that ignored The Voice. And this is why I think a lot of people think that this will be a quasi-veto in practice, if not in strict theory.
Right, that's a lot of things you said. Let's just go to one of those things, which was what the Prime Minister said. In that instance that you're referring to, it was a question specifically about lifting or maintaining grog restrictions in the Northern Territory, something which you would expect the Indigenous Voice to have strong knowledge and views on. So it wasn't a broad point that the Prime Minister was making. Just on the veto, clearly, the wording of The Voice says that it may make representations. And as we understand, it's up to Parliament to decide exactly how it's going to operate. There are plenty of senior legal minds who question that statement about a veto. Aren't you overstating the power of something that may make representations?
Well, I think we should always be very cautious about constitutional change. And in the end, it doesn't matter what the legislation says, because you can't out-legislate the Constitution.
But the Constitution
itself trumps legislation.
Indeed, the Constitution will say may make representation, not that the Parliament is obliged to follow that representation.
I'm not going to argue with you on that point, but Sarah, the right to make representations implies a duty on the government and the Parliament to take those representations seriously, and that's why I think it's not at all unreasonable to expect that the High Court will insist upon very careful consideration by government of anything The Voice says. It's
not a given, of course, that the High Court would take any case brought on behalf of The Voice if it felt its representations weren't being listened to. But I just want to put what Justice French said. Even if that did eventuate, and he regards it as unlikely, he said, if it did eventuate, it would not outweigh the immense potential benefit to the Australian people from The Voice proposal. So aren't you worrying about something that may happen and forgetting about the benefits that The Voice supporters think it's going to bring?
Well, I dispute that The Voice is going to bring those benefits, and I don't see why any particular group of Australians, however much they might be respected, should have their own special voice to the government and to the Parliament over and above the voice that every other Australian gets. So my point is, why are we singling out the first Australians for this special voice, given that I want all Australians to move forward together as one country where there is no privilege of origin, no hierarchy of descent, in Bob Hawke's legendary words to the bicentenary back in 1988.
Let me put this phrase again, something that you wrote. Even if The Voice would finally remedy the near-failed state that remote Australia has largely become, it could hardly justify, and this is what you're saying, the unequal treatment inherent in such a change. But hasn't exactly that unequal treatment of Indigenous people been a fact of life in Australia since the first settlement?
I'm not saying that we've got it all right. I'm not saying that for a second. But I don't think that you could say that in recent times at least there's been any lack of goodwill, any lack of generosity of spirit, and certainly any lack of generosity of funding. For instance, in remote schools, which is where the educational disadvantage is most acute, the funding on average is about 50% per student greater.
And yet, as we know from Closing the Gap, from all of those statistics, that it is not succeeding in closing the gap. I think the question is, you're not denying, surely, that the history of death and dispossession, of the stolen generations, of cultural eradication, Indigenous incarceration, have been a fact of Australian life.
But it's not an entirely dark story, if I may say. And if it were an entirely dark story, you wouldn't have wonderful Australians and proud Indigenous people like Jacinta Price and Warren Mundine saying we should vote no because this is a divisive voice. It won't necessarily be my voice or even our voice. If you're an Australian for constitutional equality, you probably should say no to this activist's voice.
Well, let me just pick you up on activists. You frequently use that phrase about people campaigning for the yes case. All great victories of social justice were achieved by activism, getting rid of the eradication of slavery, the eradication of segregation, racial segregation in the United States, women's suffrage. What's wrong with activism?
Well, let it be the right activism, not the wrong activism. And if you go back far enough, you've got people like the Colonial Advocate General, Plunkett, who was the man who insisted on bringing the prosecution against the Myall Creek murderers. So, look, it's not just activists who bring about good things. It was the Holt government that brought about the 1967
I think I'm
referendum.
Questioning your denigration of activism. Yeah. But look, you've always argued, as Noel Pearson has, for liberation for Indigenous people from the welfare state mentality. Isn't the voice a unique opportunity for the kind of self-reliance that you've been arguing for years?
I think the voice is more doubling down on failure, frankly, than a fresh start. And I think part of the problem is, as I said at the beginning, this sense of separatism. Yes, of course we've got to get Aboriginal kids to school. Of course we've got to get Aboriginal adults into work. Of course we've got to get Indigenous communities safe. But it's this assumption that there are separate standards that should apply to Indigenous kids, adults and communities.
But that unique history that we just talked about, does that not create a unique set of experiences and consequences in contemporary Australia? And Closing the Gap, the statistics suggest that it does.
Well, people like Jacinta Price and Warren Mundine...
You named two Indigenous people, but the majority of Indigenous people, as we understand it in the polling at the moment, support the voice. I don't think you can keep going back to two people.
Well, the polling done for Message Stick, which was reported in the paper the other day, and I understand that Message Stick is a pro-voice entity, that polling, if the reporting was accurate, said that there were 25% of Indigenous people who voted no and something like 40% who didn't know, which is 65%, if my arithmetic is correct, of Indigenous people who are either no or don't know. So I think this idea that Aboriginal people speak with one voice on this is just wrong. And again, this is one of the many reasons why I think giving Indigenous people their own special voice, as if, unlike everyone else, they should be unanimous about everything.
No one's making an assumption that they should be unanimous.
Well, in that case, it kind of becomes almost like a separate Indigenous parliament. And we do not need, in our system at this time, a separate Indigenous chamber or parliament.
How do you get from different views in the Indigenous community to a separate chamber? I thought you had already set aside the notion of it being a third chamber or fourth arm of government.
It's interesting that in a submission to the to the Senate, to the parliamentary inquiry, Professors Aroni and Gerangelos, respectively of Sydney and Queensland University Law Schools, they said that this voice would effectively be a fourth arm of government, in addition to the legislative, the executive and the judicial. Well, I think it will be a very, very major constitutional change, by far the biggest constitutional change we've ever been asked to make. And I think that it's wrong in principle. I think it would work out badly in practice. But if the government had I think, a better attitude on this, they would have proceeded in a much more bipartisan way. There would have been a constitutional convention.
And yet, I think we have to be in the situation that we are now. Let's just get practical about it for a moment, because your former Liberal colleague Ken Wyatt described it like this. He went back and reviewed his papers from his time in government as a minister. When papers were circulated before legislation, he said they would list the stakeholders. He said there were never Indigenous names on those list of stakeholders. Isn't that exactly what The Voice would do? Bring an Indigenous voice to the formation of legislation before it reaches Parliament when it's too late?
Well, there are all sorts of things that could be done if there is considered to be a lack of adequate consultation. There are all sorts of things that could be done short of a dramatic and potentially quite radical discontinuity in our constitutional
arrangements.
Yet a
patient process involving a very large number of people, more than 1,200 delegates to the Uluru Dialogues over a number of years, came up with this solution. What makes you think that you know better than they do about how to improve the living conditions and the life expectancy for Indigenous Australians?
In the end, Sarah, the Constitution belongs to all of us. It doesn't just belong to Indigenous people, it belongs to all of us. And so any amendment to properly recognise Indigenous Australians, which is a very desirable objective, should be something that all of us can own and should be something that all of us have contributed to. And this is why I always thought that the best way to recognise Indigenous people was to amend the preamble to say that we were one indissoluble federal commonwealth with an Indigenous heritage, a British foundation and an immigrant character, because it's true, we are all of those things. How much weight you wanted to put on any of the three elements would be up to you, but it would be a very good shorthand description of the way Australia has gone, and there would be something in it for everyone, and indigeneity would be one of the three pillars on which modern Australia rests.
Let's talk about how the campaign is going. Linda Burney made some criticisms yesterday of the campaign that you're involved in, using Trump-like tactics. This was produced today. I think you've seen it. It's a cartoon-like drawing, and it's been condemned as featuring a racial trope in the depiction of Thomas Mayo. Do you approve of that imagery?
Look, the Fin Review must have thought it was all right because they published it.
I'm asking you.
Well, I'm saying
you don't take your lead from the Fin Review.
I'm saying that the Fin Review printed it.
But you, Tony Abbott, are capable of having a view as to whether or not that's an acceptable image in contemporary Australian campaigning.
If it were me, I wouldn't have done it. But as I said, the Fin Review accepted the advertisement.
We'll take it that you wouldn't have done it. I just want to switch mood for a minute. Noel Pearson said that if the Voice campaign fails, he'll withdraw from public life. He's a prophet that you once revered.
Yeah, and Marcia Langton said that there'd be no more welcomes to country. And
you have a relationship.
I think we have too many welcomes to country right now.
And just stay with this. You have a relationship with Noel Pearson. You've described him as a prophet in the past. Will you feel some personal responsibility if this fails and Noel Pearson does, as he says, withdraw from public life?
I think that Australia at the moment, because of the way this has gone, is in a lose-lose situation. If this voice gets up, I think it will be very damaging in the long term and wrong in principle. If it goes down, there will be a lot of very disappointed people, and some people will feel perhaps embittered. And that's no good thing either.
Put yourself on the other side, if you would, of the campaign just for a moment. Imagine the consequences of a no vote. Do you accept that such an outcome would inflict psychic scars, not just on your old friend Noel Pearson, but on Indigenous people across Australia?
All of us have got to get used to the fact that we win some and we lose some. I obviously have lost elections as well as won them. And I accept that this is something that a lot of people on both sides would feel deeply. But regardless of the outcome of this particular referendum, I certainly will continue to support Indigenous recognition. And if people feel on the defeat of the Voice that there is an ongoing need for proper Indigenous recognition in the Constitution, well, I'm their man.
Tony Abbott, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.